Okay, so good to have you in today's lesson. We're going to look at data types. Right, so the concept of data type, I can liken it to a farmer who plants crops. And so you cannot mix, let's say, peanuts and maize and soya beans in one field, okay? So you have to separate these because when you want to perform certain operations on these plants, you have to be specific to a particular plant that you're working on. Okay, so it's the same with data types. In Python, we actually bundle these data types into classes, what we call classes, so that when we want to perform operations on a particular data type, we are clear of the operations that we're going to perform on that particular data type. Okay, so let's jump into the data types that we have in Python. All right, so for those who have, learned some other languages, you realize that these data types apply to, to a number of programming languages. Okay, so before we go any further, it's a good idea to introduce the main types of data that we use in Python. So these are the main types. These are not the only types that we have, but these are the main types. So each value in Python is a type. So text like hello world is called a string. Whole numbers are called integers. And obviously, we have what we call decimal point numbers. We call them floats. So now we have already encountered strings, integers, so you know what that means. Time to float. Okay, but before we go any further, I want to show you something here. Okay, so when we are dealing with data types in Python, there's a special function that we have in Python that helps us to check the type of a given data. So we use what we call the type function. And as usual, when you are dealing with functions, you write the name of the function followed by a parenthesis or brackets. And so inside here, we want to type in hello world. So we want to check what type of data is hello world. So if I save this by pressing Ctrl S and then Ctrl B to run it, you will see down here, like I said, guys, because we bundle these types of data into groups, related groups, which we call classes. Okay, so we can perform certain operations on strings. Okay, so strings, related data type, string data type. There are certain operations that are applicable to the strings that might not be applicable to, to numbers. So that's why we bundle them into classes like this. So this hello world is recognized as a string. Okay. One thing to note: anything that has quotations around it is recognized as a string. For instance, 1, 2. The number 12, it's a number, but once you put in quotation marks, let's save this and run this, you realize it becomes a string. If I do away with these quotation marks and then write 12 directly without any quotation marks, you realize that this is recognized as a different data type. It's recognized as an integer, int for integer. Okay, so however, if I put a comma here, 1, 2, this is now a different data type. If I run this, you realize it's recognized as a floating point number, okay, which is a decimal point number. All right, so these are the three main data types that we're looking at that we have in Python. Like I said, that does not necessarily mean that that's all we have, okay? We have some other data types, but we're looking at the main type that you encounter in the course of our, of our tutorials. Okay, so we noted we have strings, we have integers, and we have floats. Okay, so floats and integers, these are numbers, but they are divided into two. All right, so let's continue. Which of these will be stored as a float? So which one would you store as a float over here? So is 42 a float? No, that's an integer. Hey, with quotation marks, is it a float? That's a string. And so 7.4 is going to be our float. All right, so we continue. Floats. So we know what floats are. They are numbers with a decimal. But how do we produce them? Okay, we can. There are so many ways of producing floats. So if you perform any operation between a float and an integer, the result is going to be a float. Whether you are adding, you are multiplying, you are dividing, or you are subtracting. We can prove that by removing the type here, and let's say we want to add 2 plus 1.0 like this. Save this and run this. You see down here we have 3.0. 3.0 is a float. It's a floating point number. Any operation that you perform between an integer and a float, the answer is going to be a float. So that's how we produce floats. We can also produce floats by dividing two integers. Okay, so if we are dividing, we always get a float. So let me divide 10 divided by 2 and see what happens. Okay, so down here you see it always gives you a 5.0. So we said if we use 1// we will always get a float. All right, so if you divide, you always get a float. And then if you perform any other operation, if that is to add, to multiply, or to subtract an integer with a float, you always get a float. Okay, so two integers, obviously, if you add them, they will give you